For most, you only reach a position of leadership, if you do reach that position, with quite a long apprenticeship. It's much better if you get the opportunity to have been in the foothills before you try to climb Mount Everest, because there are things you learn on the way, not just about what you should be doing, but what you should avoid doing.
Hello again from Hong Kong on the night the colony is about to be handed back to China. At last, the moment has arrived. After 156 years of British rule, China takes over the vibrant and enormously successful island of Hong Kong and the new territories.
My name is Malcolm Rifkind. I served for many years in politics in the United Kingdom, and I served in Margaret Thatcher's cabinet and then John Major's cabinet. And the two final jobs I had were as Defense Secretary and then as Foreign Secretary, what in the United States would be Secretary of State. In that capacity, I was responsible in the mid-1990s for supervising under the Prime Minister the transfer of Hong Kong back to China. We never had an undisputed and unlimited possession of Hong Kong. Under the original treaty with China, we were entitled to control most of Hong Kong for no more than 100 years. And at the end of that period, under international law, which we never disputed, the territory had to be handed back to China.
It is Britannia's last voyage, the epilogue of empire.
A slow march into a new order.
It wasn't a very nice feeling to actually have to transfer a British territory to a communist Chinese state. But that's what international law required. And the objective was to try and entrench democratic institutions in Hong Kong and to extend them wherever possible before the handover of Hong Kong to China. And I once was very anxious, as was the British government as a whole, to work as closely we could with the consent of the people of Hong Kong, because they were the people who would actually have to live with the consequences of what we are doing.
Now, Hong Kong people are to run Hong Kong. That is the promise, and that is the unshakable destiny.
As we approach June 1997, there are a number of matters still to be finally dealt with. But first I want to hear the views of the people of Hong Kong so that I can be fully informed, very sensitive to how these matters are seen in Hong Kong.
I was going to go to Beijing to see the Chinese Foreign Minister, Chen Chi-chen, and this would have been around about 1995 and 96. And I deliberately went through Hong Kong first. I didn't go directly to Beijing because I wanted to be quite open with the Hong Kong people about my visit to Beijing, and I wanted to hear from them what their priorities were. And when I met them, they said, well, one of our priorities, actually, when you see the Chinese foreign minister, please tell him that when we become part of China again under two systems in one country, we're not only naturally anxious that we'll still be able to have our normal freedoms that we're used to vote for more than one candidate at any elections that we have, but what's equally important to us is what we call the rule of law. It means that the government, the politicians, everyone is subject to the law of the land. And if anyone is doing anything contrary to the law, including the government, you can go to independent judges who are not controlled by the politicians, and they will decide whether the law is on your side or not on your side. That is basically the rule of law. So when I went to Beijing and I was with the Chinese foreign minister, and I put this point to him, I said, you know, I've just come from Hong Kong, and what the people of Hong Kong are anxious is whether they will continue to enjoy the rule of law when they become again part of China. And I've never forgotten his reply. He said, oh, don't worry, Mr. Rifkind. We in China, we too believe in the rule of law. In China, the people must obey the law. And I said to him, now hold on a moment, Minister. When we talk about the rule of law, it's not just the people who must obey the law, it's the government must be under the law. There must be independent judges who can tell the government you're not allowed to do this to people in terms of their legal rights. He not only didn't agree with me, he hadn't the faintest idea what I was talking about. If you're Mr. Putin or Xi Jinping or any dictator, the idea that you as a government are subordinate to independent judges is quite inconsistent with the system that you have created. So there had to be a political way of resolving this.
China rules Hong Kong under the principle of one country, two systems. This unique status gives the people of Hong Kong basic rights like freedom of speech and freedom of assembly that are not available in other parts of China. Beijing, however, retains control over foreign and defense policy.
And the two systems in one country did provide a way that not only both sides, but also the people of Hong Kong were prepared to work with and to see if it could be delivered. But what was unexpected on this occasion, but also satisfactory at that time, was that the Chinese leader, Deng Xiaoping, on his own initiative, said that he was willing to arrange a treaty with the United Kingdom so that after Hong Kong became part of China, for 50 years, it would continue to have full autonomy and would continue to observe the political and social freedoms as it had previously exercised, as are more familiar in the United Kingdom, and would not be expected to accept a communist state of a totalitarian kind that China is. That wasn't Deng Xiaoping just being friendly. It's because Hong Kong was hugely important to them for two reasons. First of all, economically. At that time, China was not as developed as it is today. And Hong Kong was a vital way of raising capital through Hong Kong. People were willing to be based in Hong Kong because it had the rule of law, because it was a free society, because it was used to dealing with capital transfers. And China as a whole benefited from that. But the other thinking that Deng Xiaoping had, very relevant today, is, of course, there was the issue even then of Taiwan. And what he hoped was that if Hong Kong was able to show that you could have two systems in one country on a voluntary basis, then one day the people of Taiwan, the government of Taiwan, might agree on a voluntary basis to reunite Taiwan with what they call the Chinese motherland. Of course, in more recent times, and what's happened over the last year, that has become inconceivable that the Taiwanese would ever agree to that. But at the time, it did not seem as unrealistic an aspiration.
And then, at the stroke of midnight, history edged Hong Kong out of the arms of Britain. The generation who will grow to adulthood as Chinese citizens looked on in wonder.
Britain and China were the two governments that signed the treaty, and the treaty was deposited with the United Nations precisely to demonstrate that it was an international treaty, and it had 50 years before it expired. So as we speak, there's already still 26 years to go. So for the first half of that period, I think it's fair to say the Chinese government, they might not have honored every letter of what they committed themselves to, but broadly speaking, Hong Kong remained a free society linked to a communist dictatorship. That's ceasing to be true as we speak.
On a Hong Kong side street, the police were still chasing the protesters. In some cases, violently. Mayhem keeping its momentum.
We knew that China was not going to suddenly become democratic. But there were two mistakes, I think, that were made, not just by Britain, by America, by the Western world as a whole. The first was we perhaps were naive in believing on the inevitability of once communist countries gradually transforming, however slowly, in the liberal democratic direction. We were perhaps naive in that, and perhaps we shouldn't have been. What we didn't expect, and I don't think anybody expected that, in the United States and Western Europe or elsewhere, was under the current president, Xi Jinping, not only would China not become more liberal, it would actually become much more repressive than it had been at any time since the death of Mao Zedong. So we've had, for example, the ghastly treatment of the Uyghurs in Western China, in what are little more than concentration camps. But we also have the destruction of Hong Kong's autonomy. And we also, for the rest of the Chinese population, hundreds of millions of them, subject to a degree of electronic surveillance that was simply not technically available to earlier Chinese governments or dictators.
We'll have all to do our best to ensure that there is a smooth and successful transition, but it is much more difficult because of these deep disagreements on these two issues.
The power that you've got, and in a democracy, that is power you have temporarily. It may be for 2 or 3 years, it may be for 5 years, it may be 10 years, it's unlikely to be much more than that. You should use that to hope to see and to plan to see at the end of whatever period you have, either your country or your community or the world, depending on the job you're doing, at least slightly better than you saw it when you started. You tend to see the glass either half full or half empty. And we all know that a glass that is half full is also inevitably half empty. So what I'm saying is there is also the choice between the optimist and the pessimist. The pessimist is someone who believes that things couldn't be worse. The optimist, on the other hand, is someone who knows they could be worse. And that's what makes me an optimist. Because if you look, for example, at the world today, people often say, oh, look at all these terrible problems we have with dictatorships in China and Russia, with cyber attacks, with pandemics, with all climate change, with all these sort of things. And I tend to say, because I'm a glass half full person, you're quite right, I don't diminish anything you say, but imagine we were sitting here in 1938, with Hitler in power in Berlin, with Stalin in power in Moscow, with Mussolini in Italy, with Franco and the fascists in Spain, with most of the world colonized, no control over its own future, and with all the others, and with a world war just about to start. So, relatively speaking, the glass half full is better than the glass half empty.